Hi, this is Dr. Scott, and today we're going to get into the commercial real estate market collapse that I believe is going to help be a part of bringing about a debt reset. Now, I know everyone's thinking about Iran. Today is, June 22nd, because last night Trump bombed three different places in Iran. I've always said this is a financial and a military situation. So you're seeing some of the military on the other end. I'm going to show you a cool video about Iran here in a second, but or a little bit here, but I want to spend some time upon the real estate crisis because no one's taking enough time frame. The reason why I bring this up is that the building owner called me on Friday. There's a bit of a conversation about a couple things. And he was asking about if I would extend my lease. Now, my lease comes up due in November of 26, right? And I'm like, dude, no, my dream is to own the building, and I really want to own this building, and I believe that we're going to be able to do that. But I don't want to have a new lease for my hearing side of the business. I'm going to have the ministry side and the hearing side in the same building. I mean, it's just going to work together. And so that's kind of why I'm thinking about this. And I mentioned to him, who's he's a good guy. He just not very red pilled on this situation. And I said, commercial real estate is really struggling right now because of the rates. And his conversation back to me, well, the rates have been pretty consistent. If you really look at it over a year's period of time, they're pretty consistent. And I'm like, you can say that, but and I said back to him, I said, in 1980s, uh, all rates, interest rates were 17, 18, 19%. But when real estate, when you could buy a house in the early 80s for 50, 60, $70,000 if the interest rate was 12 or so percent, because it's always lower than the interest rate you would get for a car or a credit card kind of thing. It's always lower because it's based upon the bond market. Interest rates for houses and commercial real estate look at a couple different areas, not just the interest rates of the Fed that set it. That's the basis point, right? But it's also the bond market. When the bond market is changing, you're going to see the rates changing. And as the bond markets, many times right now, they're tanking left and right, which pops those interest rates up. And I'm going to show you some kind of interesting points about that. Now, we had this conversation. I said, yeah, but when cheaper prices are there, shoot, you could give this argument over and over again. But now, if you think about just even for a car loan, I mean, cars are expensive, and then you have car loans that are 7, 8, 10, 12%. You're going, no way, I can't afford that. And so the car market's dying on the vine. The personal real estate loans are just outrageous. And I'll show you some of that. But the commercial real estate is even worse because you're talking about a much more expensive purchase than anything else you would ever do. And what happens on commercial real estate, you don't have to put as much money down, but it's a shorter loan than the traditional 30-year loans. In the commercial real estate, it's a 10, 15, 20-year loan. And so, and the bank is going to like require a ton more paperwork from that individual and or the company to be able to make sure that they can make the payments, which means there's more regulations that are upon you on a business type of loan. And I've dealt with that many times. Not only when you think about yourself, you're trying to prove, what my credit ratio is, right? You can do a credit report and how much I make, right? And making sure that, there's enough money in savings and checking, blah, 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 right? That's all you have to worry about. But in commercial real estate, you have to do that. Plus, you have to look at the financials of the company. or the organization that comes up. And if there's any other interaction that the owners are in, all of the personal financials, all the business financials will be looked at as well, which complicates any kind of deal, which means that most of the deals struggle to get through, and especially right now. Okay, so I want you to see this kind of chart here. When we look at this in 2008, right before 2008, this is the office delinquency rate. What that means is that a very tiny number of people had any delinquency in their building. I mean, like less than 1%, was out there. Now, if you look through, now there was a spike in 2000. We don't want to get into that one in a second. But by this point in time, there was not a spike. It was really available to get into offices. 2008, and then 2009 is really when it started spiking. Now it's up 7, 8, 9%, 10% over this ugly thing. Now, the Obama timeframe, it started to come down, but it didn't really get better. And then in the beginning of the oil bust, this is the beginning of Trump. So Obama got, had some, good things that happened to him, but not enough to really make a huge difference. It didn't drop down to those numbers. And then the end of Obama, beginning of Trump is here. And then look, those numbers go down to the bottom of the bottom floor. Now, Biden takes over in 2021, and there's a spike point that comes in here. I mean, but not huge issue. That is really pretty low. And I keep saying to people this, in 2023, something burst. It's because the interest rates were super low right here, and you could kind of get into different things, cars, houses, business loans. But then look at the rate, look at the delinquency rate. People are walking away, and they're spiking up as bad, and they're probably going to go show worse if we really could show you into 2025, worse than it was in the worst time frame of that crisis with that too. You go, oh, wait a second. Well, let's show you another kind of area that comes out here. Oops, come on. Sorry, you got to make it come over here. Okay, so this is, now this is a year ago, the U.S. commercial, let me make that bigger for you guys. U.S. commercial real estate is heading toward a crisis. I mean, so this is Harvard Business Review. These guys, very, very liberal kind of thing in their viewpoint, but they're showing you how the circumstance happens. And they claim it's the global pandemic, blah, 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 long-term upending, perpetual subdued inflation, low interest rates, and in-office work. Well, by the way, that has messed around with the situation, which means occupancy, has gone, down the toilets. But it didn't go, if you remember here a second ago, did occupancy rates go down here? Well, this is when people started to work from home, but after a little bit, they kind of said, you know what, we don't have enough people coming in, and we're just taking off out of here. We don't need to do this. But now Trump is telling them they got to go back to work, but how are they going to be able to go back into the offices? So when we look back at this kind of thing, they didn't even understand that what was going to come out in that situation. There are small banks, mid-sized banks, that loans are far exceeding their risk levels. Like 158 to 228, that is being underneath. Your loans are so high that you can't even possibly pay them back if they default on you. And then the large banks are 142%. And the biggest banks, see, that's what they were trying to do. They wanted, like the central banks, the Fed bankers, in essence, to have the best ability to ride it through. So they wanted to take out all these small banks. That's what their whole goal was with that too. Okay. So, and they're talking about what could trigger the crisis, blah, blah, blah. We've talked about, we're talking about that a little bit more, a little bit more, excuse me. Okay. So let me pull that off. Shut up. I don't have to show you this. Okay. So more trouble due to come in 2024. So this is basically in the beginning, first quarter of 2024, and we're seeing some of the same stuff. So one of the things that happens is that major groups are losing their rates. So they used to be 1.2% year over year, but now that's an impossibly, difficult number to kind of keep up with. The look at this. The reflected vacancy rates compared to national norm. Boston sitting 12%, national rates are 17.9%. I mean, you just can't deal with that. And in those very, very liberal cities that were allowing people to come in and steal up to $950 of their stuff, these people are going, I'm done. 24%. That's craziness with that too. The global markets are not much different on this, and this is the part I find super fascinating. Look at the interest rates, the 10-year yields. This is the bond market I was telling you about. And so they're going up and up and up, and that means your rate is going to go up as well. Now the Fed has been slowly sort of dropping the rates, but from 5.5 to 4.5 is nothing. Now you say, what does that mean? Well, interest rates have been traditionally, and this is what I said to a financial advisor back in 2020, and I said, that Japan is sitting at 220% or more on debt to income ratio or debt to GDP. And he goes, well, yeah, but interest rates are super low and they can keep doing it. They just keep printing money. But what happens when interest rates aren't 0 or 0.5, 0.75%, which is what they were back in 2020? and he was sort of right, but he was sort of wrong. Anytime it starts spiking to this, well, they can't make money in the same way that they were used to doing, right? So here's one of the things that happens. And this is over a year ago. 175 billion is already distressed, and lenders in some markets are warning of borrowers growing risk of foreclosure. The foreclosure on these big ones are so difficult because what they do is they'll clear out whole areas. If you have I want you to think about real estate. If you're looking at a big shopping center, but if one of the big ones, like the target of that, the anchor of the stores go out, no one wants to go over there because there's nothing there anymore. There's just the little small things, right? Even though there's Target, there might be a Sports Clips and blah, 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 other places. But if there's no Target over there, then you don't go necessarily to the Sports Clips and you don't go over to the market, kind of thing, the small little market that is nichey and all those different nichey things. And so that's what they're telling you that's happening. And the commercial real estate's falling, the prices are falling, but they're not falling fast enough to make up the difference of those variable rates with that too. And so you ask, well, what are those interest rates? Well, guess what they are? June of 25, interest rates are 5.5 to 10.5%. To give you an example of what that means on an overall basis, I'm just going to make up a $2 million, kind of thing, place. Oops, sorry. So you're talking about the difference of, and I'm just trying to give you, what you would be in the past. So you're talking about the interest that would come in a year, at least $100,000 more in interest payments. So, and there's probably more like $150,000. So you're saying $150,000. Well, that is $1,000 more a month, at least, that small place that would have to do. And you're going, how do I come up with another $1,000 to make it? Because commercial real estate, just to make it worthwhile, if you have a building with other types of leases in it, that what will happen to that kind of thing is when the rates are like that, you have to have 90% of that building filled up. And if you walk into a building and it's not 90%, they better have owned that building, and even if they own the building, they're still struggling on the rates. And if they don't own the building, they're underneath, and there's only a certain amount of time frame before they can't do it anymore. And so this is why these kinds of things are so ugly in this process with that too. And so I'm trying to tell you that these areas here, these areas are telling you that this has to happen. I was talking to a friend of mine and we were talking about financial issues. And I said, do you understand that there is like a shotgun pointed at the commercial real estate, virtual one, commercial real estate, personal real estate, credit card issues, auto loans, auto distressed loans, small banks, mid-sized banks, larger banks, and you're going, and when the largest banks start getting on more of the assets, because once the small banks start to fail, which they'll fail a little bit more up to, and then it floats up to the large banks because you can't really defer out those amounts. Well, guess what happens? You have a crisis, and I keep saying to people, that crisis is coming. Scott Bessent of the Treasury said, if we don't refinance the $37 trillion of debt, guess what happens? And we're talking about refinance in July. Today is the end of June, right? We're at the end of June kind of time frame, and you're going, but if by end of July they don't refinance the debt, and the debt used to be financed at these 1, 2, 3%. Now the debt has to be financed at 4 or 5%. When it used to cost you 13% in the last couple of years, it was 13% of the gross domestic product, or whatever the government brought in, the federal government brought in, they were spending on just interest. And if you have to refi that into a new loan with a higher interest rate, that means what? 15, 17, 25%? You're talking about like unlivable numbers. We're already underneath, and that crisis is everywhere around you. And so what I say to you is this: you got this kind of thing happening in the background. Watch this. I'm going to mute it because it doesn't really matter. There's runs on the bank, even in, well, we'll show you this, but there's runs on the bank all over the place, and there's runs in Iran. Why would there be a run on the smaller mid-sized bank? And there's not like, the capitalism here. These are bigger banks that are actually doing. People are struggling to be able to make it in that way. And yet this is happening only in this was actually right now as of 3 days ago. And those big bunker busters that blew up, that Trump did last night on Saturday, the 21st, what do you think that has to do with the banking situation? You might say, well, so what? What does that have to do with anything? What I'm telling you is that this whole system has to get reset. What's the reset? It is, we have to have the killing off of the IRS. By the way, the new IRS commissioner hated the IRS and tried to close them down. And now he's the IRS commissioner. Do you think that they're going to stick around? No. The gold-backed currency has to happen because the Fed can't do it anymore. And that will reset the debts as well. Guys, we're on the edge. I know it's irritating every week, every month that goes by that it hasn't happened. I would love it to have occurred already. But hold on, because as these things happen, there is a point of no return, and we're past that point of no return. It's like you're driving down the road and you think, well, I missed my turnoff, but you really didn't turn away from the area. And if you really did looked at your maps, now remember when I was growing up, in the 70s, the 60s and 70s, and when I first started to drive, early 80s, I was looking at this, I mean, there's no maps. I mean, you had to know where you were going, right? I mean, you had to pull out a map if you wanted to, but it was a big old nasty map, and you couldn't do that in the car, right? You had to have a driver, I mean, a passenger just to be able to do that. Right now, we're driving toward the end, and that end is a dead end. And there's no way to do it. It will stop the economy. And guess what? That to you might be the scary thing. That to me is not the scary thing. That's the fun part of this whole thing. Hold on. I promise you the ride gets really good. Thanks so much.